Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Today, I'm speaking about the visit of the Foreign Minister of Syria to Saudi Arabia, why this visit is so important, and I will give you some historical context and also political context, something that you will not find on most of the YouTube channels that present to you so-called geopolitical analysis. Now, I want to a little bit go back in history and tell you, look, the relationship between Syria and Saudi Arabia weren't really always on good terms. Sometimes they were good and sometimes they were really, really bad. And the worst was during the CIA regime change war on Syria. But if we go a few decades back, and especially in 1979, when the Iranian revolution happened and the Khomeini came to power, Hafez al-Assad, the former president of Syria, he supported the Iranian revolution. And the Saudis were really worried about the Iranian revolution and the spread of the Shiism in the region, or the overall the influence of Iran over the region. In 1979, Saddam Hussein has been pushed by the CIA to wage a war against the Khomeini in Iran. And the Saudis funded and supported the Saddam Hussein to fight against the Iranians. However, Hafez al-Assad took the opposite side and supported the Iranians. And it wasn't only a diplomatic support or verbal support. Syria actually presented or provided Iran with technology and information and knowledge to produce long-range missiles and military expertise in order to fight against Saddam Hussein. And the Saudis were really upset with the Syrians for standing with Iran against the Saudi-backed Saddam Hussein back then. And this has lasted between 1979 and 1988, as you may know, the war between Iraq and Iran. But during this same time, because Syria stood with Iran, Saudi Arabia supported the Muslim Brotherhood organization in Syria between 1979 and 1982. And during this time, as you also may remember, there was another armed insurgency, but on the leadership of Hafez al-Assad back then. And they occupied parts of Aleppo, they occupied parts of Hama. They committed, I remember, horrendous crimes because I have read the history, and my father back then was also young, and he told me what happened during that time. It was similar to the era of 2011 and 2018 when the terrorist organizations committed these horrendous crimes. So the relationship between Syria and Saudi Arabia wasn't really good. They weren't on good terms between 1979, for example, and 1988. But after 1988, when the Soviet Union started to become weaker and weaker, and in 1989, 1990, the Soviet Union has collapsed, Syria was a strategic ally with the Soviet Union, and they always had the backing of the Soviet Union. So Syria found itself alone after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And during this same time, Saddam Hussein, if you remember, invaded Kuwait. And when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, this time Syria stood with Kuwait again against Saddam Hussein. But on this particular event, the Saudis and the rest of the Gulf countries supported Kuwait against Saddam Hussein. So this time Syria was on the side of Saudi Arabia and on the side of the United States against Saddam Hussein, because Syria lost its international backer. This was, of course, one of the reasons. And they opened up with the Americans again. And the Americans promised Syria that if they receive support from Syria against Saddam Hussein, they will revive the peace talks between Israel and Syria, and promised that they will return the Golan Heights to the Syrians, which never materialized later. So after 1990, I would say between 1990 and the year 2000, till 2003, the relations were really good between Saudi Arabia and Syria, and Saudi supported the Syrian economy, and the Syrian economy recovered after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 2003, with the invasion of Iraq, the Saudis were on the side of the Americans, and the Syrians chose to be against the Americans this time. Against the Americans, but they didn't support Saddam Hussein, physically or militarily, but they were against the invasion. And they knew, because after Iraq, it was Syria on the hit list, so they didn't want for the Americans to have an easy way in Iraq. And as we say in Arabic, they tried to sink the American forces in the soil of Iraq and supported the resistance, the armed resistance against the Americans. And the Americans do not forget that, because they say hundreds of American soldiers died and perished in Iraq because of the Syrian support to the resistance there. So during this period, again, the relations weren't really good between Syria and Saudi Arabia. And these tensions heightened in 2005 after the assassination of the Prime Minister of Lebanon, Rafi al-Hariri, which was very close ally with Saudi Arabia. And Israel and the United States and the West accused Syria of assassinating the Prime Minister of Lebanon, inside of Lebanon, which again they couldn't prove up until this moment. But this incident was had an explosive impact on the region, and Syria was forced to withdraw its forces from Lebanon, which they were stationed in Lebanon to stop the civil war with the blessing of the Saudis back then. So the tensions were really high again between 2005 and 2008 between Syria and Saudi Arabia. After 2008, relations were returned again. The king of Saudi Arabia and Bashar, they met, and they solved lots of problems in Lebanon together. But in 2011, when the CIA regime change war started in Syria, the first 1 year, I would say between 2001 and 2012, Saudi Arabia was more like a cautious, and they were watching what's happening in Syria. But in 2012 and 2013, they chose to join the regime change war against Syria. In 2013, they officially took over the Syrian file from Qatar, and they waged this, I would say, big war against, non-direct war, a proxy war against Syria. In 2012, Saudi Arabia severed the diplomatic relations, so there was no more embassy or diplomatic relations between the both sides, and supported a few jihadi groups in the country. But the most notorious one or famous one was Jaish al-Islam, or Islam's army, and they occupied between 2012, 2013 till 2018 the suburbs of Damascus, especially in eastern Ghouta, and they showered Damascus, the capital of Syria, with thousands of missiles, rockets, and they committed acts of genocide, ethnic cleansing against the minorities, and they vowed to exterminate all the minorities. It was an ISIS-style rule, I would say, in eastern Ghouta by this Islam's army. There was an interesting revelation by the former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Qatar, Hamad bin Jassim. In this regard, he says that in 2013, when Bandar bin Sultan, who was the former, Hamad Jassim, who was the head of the Saudi intelligence, he said that when he received, he asked for the foreign ministers and some Arabic officials to come to Saudi Arabia, and he asked them to dedicate $2 trillion to remove Bashar al-Assad from power. I'm going to show you the video, what Hamad bin Jassim, the former foreign minister and prime minister of Qatar, said in this regard, and how much Saudi Arabia in 2013 asked to remove Bashar al-Assad from power. Check the English subtitles, guys. It's in Arabic, but I translated it into English on Syriana analysis. So Qatar was in charge of the Syrian file between 2011 and 2013. In 2013, Bandar bin Sultan came as the head of the Saudi intelligence, and he had a very close ties with the neocons in the United States, and he asked for $2 trillion to remove Bashar al-Assad from power. And this has also created a rift between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, because the Qataris wanted to stay the leading force in Syria. And since then, remember, these so-called rebel groups in Syria, they started to fight each other. They were like civil war between the rebel groups who share the same goal, which is enmity against Assad, but they were fighting also each other because the source of the funding was different. Some of them were from Qatar, others from Saudi Arabia, and they were fighting each other in the same place that they were occupying, in eastern Ghouta, in Idlib, in Aleppo, etc., etc. This has continued. This case was remained the same, I would say, between 2013 till 2018. In 2018, the Syrian government, with the backing of Russia, Hezbollah, Iran, they defeated Jaish al-Islam, Islam's army in eastern Ghouta, and they were forced to leave to Idlib and into the north. And since then, Saudi Arabia stopped supporting the terrorists in Syria, especially after MBS came as a crown prince in the country. And I'm not trying to find any justification or say MBS was different, but this is the reality. He stopped supporting these terrorists from 2018, and they tried to open security channels with the Syrian side, and there were some negotiations behind closed doors between the both sides, and between 2018 and 2023, and they were talking. And now we have the fruit for these talks. Also thanks to the Russian mediation, who was mediating between Syria and Saudi Arabia. And this came just this like recent deal between Syria and Saudi Arabia just after the Chinese brokered deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And this has helped a lot the Syrian reconciliation with Saudi Arabia, because the major issue between between Syria and Saudi Arabia is Iran. Saudis always complained about Syria's strategic relationship with Iran, always complained that Syria gave Iran an access in the Middle East, and especially in the Mediterranean, in Lebanon, in Palestine, and in different places. And they say Syria helped the growth of the Iranian influence, and that's true. I would never deny that. So if the Saudis and the Iranians get along, it will definitely reflect positively on the Syrian scene as well, and I'm happy to see that. Now, the Syrian foreign minister visited Saudi Arabia. This is a short video for the visit. This is in Saudi Arabia with both foreign ministers of Saudi Arabia and the Syrian side. And the talks were, of course, focused on the security aspects and the humanitarian aspects in the region, and the reintegration of the Syrian side into its Arabic neighborhood. And I will mention to you what they have agreed, because there was a joint statement by the both sides. And the joint statement says that both sides agreed on: one, cooperation to ensure that a political solution is found in Syria that protects Syrian territorial integrity, security, stability, and Arab identity. Two, agreement on addressing humanitarian issues and facilitating the arrival of aid to reach all regions in Syria, and preparing the ground for the return of Syrian refugees to their regions, ending their suffering and enabling a safe return to their homeland. Three, increasing efforts to restore stability to Syria. 4, strengthening security and combating terrorism in all its forms and fostering cooperation in fighting drug smuggling and trafficking. 5, commitment to support the Syrian state institutions and civil society to ensure control of Syrian territory and to end the presence of armed militia and external intervention in Syrian affairs. 6, taking steps to achieve a comprehensive political settlement of the crisis in Syria and bringing an end to all the repercussions of the conflict, including national reconciliation and amnesty. 7, returning Syria to the Arab community and resuming its historic role in the Arab world. 8, both sides welcomed the resumption of consular services and flights between both countries. So basically, I would say the focus is on a few things. One is political reconciliation among the different factions in Syria, restoring peace and stability to the region, restoration of the Syrian sovereignty over all its territory against these militias, and also restoring ties between Saudi Arabia and Syria, and the return of Syria to its Arabic neighborhood. And those are the stuff, in my opinion, that it's a win-win situation for both sides, and it serves the interests of the Syrian people inside Syria and outside of Syria. I don't see any negative aspects in this agreement, just to be very honest with you. And I think when the statement says that Syria will return to play its historic role in the statement, that's a very important thing to mention, because it means Syria will return to play the role of a balancing power in the region. Syria should play a balancing power in the region between different powers, and not to be embedded too much on any side against another. Yes, Syria committed mistakes in the past. They allowed Iranians too much in the region. They allow the Turks and the Qataris too much in the region. I think those regions of influence, these players that have strong influence in the region, this was thanks to Syria. And it was also on the expense of the Syrian influence at some point. Before this, we have to do also sometimes self-critic, as I mentioned during my conversation with Vanessa Billy in the past video, that we have to be also self-critical. The Saudis also have interests in the region, and they don't want to see the Turks are competing with them. They don't want to see Iranians competing with them, and they don't want to see Qataris competing with them. Now the the Iranian presence in Syria or in the region is a no-brainer, and it's very, I would say, hard to diminish this influence. So the work has to be done on the Turkish presence in Syria to kick them out, and also the Qatari influence. And I think the Syrians can guarantee to the Saudis that they will not give the Turks and the Qataris an access again to Syria and eventually to the Mediterranean, because it was Syria who gave them this access, and then Turkey has now influence over North Africa, over it had over Egypt, it has over Libya, and this was all thanks to Syria. So we have to deal with this issue more carefully in the future. Now, I see this as an expert on Syria, very important agreement, but not everyone agrees with me. Of course, beside the usual suspects, the United States, Israel, and the rest in the European Union, we have what I call, so we have in the United States the military industrial complex, right? I think after the Syrian war, we have the think tank industrial complex. And there are so many think tankers, or those who call themselves experts, although their expertise and knowledge do not exceed beyond their nose, and they do not know the region, they do not know the language, they do not know the Syrian society and all these particularities of the Syrian case, but they call themselves experts and they are promoted as experts. For example, Charles Lister, he calls himself an expert and the media portrays him as an expert, although he has made big mistakes in his analysis, in his recommendations. This is the guy who recommended arming jihadists in Syria and rebranded them as moderate rebels. And those were really radical jihadists. They were anti-democratic, they were anti-human rights, they were anti-women rights. They were no different from Al-Qaeda. And Charles Lister promoted this, and he convinced the American administration to arm and train them. So, in my opinion, there is blood on the hands of Charles Lister and the people that are like Charles Lister. So in any just war, these people should be behind bars. And if you put Apple in front of an apple and compare my analysis with his analysis, you will see that I was 9 times. If I was 9 times correct, he was 9 times wrong on the Syrian case. But still, he enjoys these prestigious jobs. He receives funding from state actors. He receives funding from corporations, and this institute called the Middle East Institute, it's funded by governments, including Gulf governments. So I do not understand how these Gulf countries are opening up with Syria while still funding a talking head like Charles Lister, whose main job is to continue the war in Syria, because for him this is his job. This is not his country like it's my country. This is his job, his career. He made a career out of our suffering, out of the bloodshed of the Syrian people. These people make money when there is blood and destruction. I want my people to live in peace and stability, but he is exactly the opposite. So in a just war, in a just word, this person should be behind bars. And this is his latest tweet on the matter, and I'm going to show you how ugly and stupid this person is. Appalling and desperately short-sighted. He's telling the Saudis that they're short-sighted, although he receives money from the Gulf countries. Saudi has welcomed Assad's foreign minister, of course it's not Syrian foreign minister, Assad's foreign minister Faisal Maqdad and deputy foreign minister Ayman Susan to Jeddah. This isn't de-escalation, it's unconditional submission to a criminal regime, a narco state and ally of Iran's IRGC. So as you can see, this guy is really butt burn, and He wants for the conflict to continue. He wants for the enmity to be to continue between Syria and Saudi Arabia, because he makes money out of it. This is a very profitable business. And I would encourage the Gulf countries, instead of funding such talking heads that only create more chaos and confusion in the region, to fund people who are really for peace and stability between the Arabic countries, between Saudi Arabia and Syria, between Syria and the Emirates, between Syria, Iran, and the rest of the Arabic countries. Because the future of this region depends on us. When we make peace and we make increase our economic relations between each other, and when there is stability, then there will come prosperity. And when there is prosperity, there will be social development. And when there is social development, even the economic and political systems will also change and become better and better. This is a win-win situation, this reconciliation between Syria and Saudi Arabia. I would just mention last thing, there are of course Syrians from the pro-government side are upset, and I understand their feelings. It's very, very, very dirty politics. Politics is very dirty. Lots of people lost their family members, friends, beloved ones because of the Saudi support for these militants in Syria. But I would say the pain would be even more, and it could be doubled if we continue this. If we continue the same path. And if we fight each other for another 10 years, there will be 500,000 more people that die in the country. Do we really want that? And what's your solution? If not diplomacy, then what? Are you going to continue fighting against Saudi Arabia, one of the richest countries in the world? They are very strong. You cannot defeat them. So it's better to talk with them and find mutual grounds between each other. And I think that's the way for this region to develop. So this was my commentary and analysis on the current visit of the Foreign Minister of Syria to Saudi Arabia. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. And if you want to support my independent commentary and journalistic work, not like I'm not funded by these states like Charles Lister, please become a patron. Link in the description below. And see you next time.